They spoke of it in hushed voices, in military headquarters, over coded messages, and in letters carefully written home. Long before the fires consumed Dresden, and years before Hitler's final shot echoed through his underground fortress, Germany's finest military minds had already reached a chilling conclusion. Victory was impossible. This realization didn't strike like lightning. It crept in gradually, first as a nagging worry, then as growing doubt, and finally as an undeniable truth. The same men who had once felt invincible now stared into the void behind their victories. They would continue to serve, continue to lead, continue to battle, but they did so knowing the ending had been written long before anyone would admit it. Summer 1941 marked the peak of German military power. In less than 2 years, Hitler's forces had swept across Poland, Norway, France, the Low Countries, and much of the Balkans. The generals who had spent the years after World War I nursing wounded pride and frustration now felt their doctrines validated. The world watched in fear as their precision and speed proved devastating. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22nd, they believed they were witnessing the ultimate expression of German military brilliance. The moment Hitler's generals knew Germany would lose. They spoke of it in hushed voices, in military headquarters, over coded messages, and in letters carefully written home. Long before the fires consumed Dresden, and years before Hitler's final shot echoed through his underground fortress, Germany's finest military minds had already reached a chilling conclusion. Victory was impossible. This realization didn't strike like lightning. It crept in gradually, first as a nagging worry, then as growing doubt, and finally as an undeniable truth. The same men who had once felt invincible now stared into the void behind their victories. They would continue to serve, continue to lead, continue to battle, but they did so knowing the ending had been written long before anyone would admit it. Summer 1941 marked the peak of German military power. In less than 2 years, Hitler's forces had swept across Poland, Norway, France, the Low Countries, and much of the Balkans. The generals who had spent the years after World War I nursing wounded pride and frustration now felt their doctrines validated. The world watched in fear as their precision and speed proved devastating. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22nd, they believed they were witnessing the ultimate expression of German military brilliance. Tank columns thundered across the endless Soviet plains. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center pushed hundreds of kilometers forward in mere weeks. Prisoners surrendered by the hundreds of thousands. By fall, many officers believed victory was imminent. Hitler's bold prediction of crushing Bolshevism in a single campaign seemed entirely possible. But underneath all this confidence, something darker stirred. Certain officers, veterans who remembered the horrors of the previous war, noticed troubling patterns. The front lines stretched too thin, supply chains grew dangerously fragile, communication lines extended impossibly long. Heinz Guderian's armored spearheads raced so far ahead that supply convoys couldn't keep pace. Motorized divisions sat immobilized, starved of fuel. Infantry units lagged days behind. Yet Berlin kept demanding deeper advances into Russia's vast heartland. By November 1941, as the first snowflakes fell on exhausted troops, that unease transformed into dread. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed as predicted. Fresh divisions kept appearing from the east. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, launched fierce counterattacks outside Moscow. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Equipment malfunctioned, and the supposedly invincible Wehrmacht ground to a halt for the first time. That winter, in field headquarters and frontline positions, the first fatal doubts took root. Officers who had believed in a swift, decisive victory now faced the same grinding war of attrition they had sworn to avoid. Supply systems were crippled, reserves ran dry, morale fractured. Some began whispering that the war was already beyond winning. Others refused to acknowledge such thoughts. But everyone who survived that brutal winter campaign understood the truth. Germany wasn't fighting a campaign anymore. It was trapped in a war of exhaustion against an enemy they had catastrophically underestimated. In 1942, Hitler demanded new offensives to regain momentum. The generals obeyed, but their confidence rang hollow. The Wehrmacht launched Case Blue, driving towards the Caucasus oil fields and the Volga River. The plan was ambitious but reckless, dividing forces across enormous distances. Field Marshal von Bock protested, warning that splitting armies between Stalingrad and the Caucasus invited disaster. Hitler's response: "You always see the worst in everything." Bock was removed from command. As the panzers rolled south, many officers recognized the campaign's fatal flaws. The distances were immense, supply lines overextended, and the Red Army, contrary to Hitler's delusions, was learning from its mistakes. By autumn, German forces were locked in savage street fighting in Stalingrad. Frontline reports painted a desperate picture. The Soviets had no intention of surrendering. When the encirclement came in November, it shocked Berlin, but not the officers who had seen the warning signs. For the first time, an entire German field army was surrounded and doomed. Inside the frozen city, General Friedrich Paulus maintained radio contact with Hitler, desperately pleading for permission to attempt a breakout. Permission never came. The Sixth Army died where it stood. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility. Officers who had once dismissed the possibility of defeat now confronted it in its purest form. An unspoken question spread like a disease. If this could happen to the finest army Germany had ever fielded, what hope remained? Spring 1943 brought no real recovery, only its illusion. The Wehrmacht prepared a massive counter-offensive at Kursk, intended to restore balance on the Eastern Front. Many generals privately doubted the plan. Intelligence reports indicated heavy Soviet fortifications. The element of surprise was gone. Yet Hitler insisted on attacking. Kursk was Germany's last great gamble of the war, and its failure sealed the strategic outcome. The Red Army's defenses held firm. German armor was decimated. When the offensive collapsed, there would be no more major victories. The generals now fought a retreating war. They could not win. After Kursk, even the most loyal officers began sensing the inevitable. Hitler still ranted about miracle weapons and the indomitable German spirit. But the men commanding those soldiers could read the maps. They watched the Red Army advancing relentlessly westward. They knew the Allies would soon strike from the west. For the first time, many realized the war wouldn't end with victory or negotiation. It would end with destruction. By the end of 1943, the mood within the officer corps had completely changed. The arrogance of 1940 had given way to quiet fatalism. German industry could no longer replace losses. Allied bombers controlled the skies. The U-boat fleet was being annihilated in the Atlantic. Generals who had once preached blind loyalty to Hitler began speaking in careful tones about salvaging what they could. Some officers began contemplating the unthinkable. Removing Hitler himself. The idea had surfaced before during moments of crisis, but now it found adherents even among high-ranking staff officers. Men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, Henning von Tresckow, and Ludwig Beck weren't merely idealists disgusted by Nazi crimes. They were professional soldiers who had concluded that Hitler was leading Germany toward annihilation. To kill him, they reasoned, wasn't treason. It was salvation. Yet such thoughts remained treacherous. The Gestapo was everywhere. Dissent, even privately expressed, could mean death. For most, it was easier to remain silent, to convince themselves that perhaps the tide might yet turn. Some placed hope in new weapons, others in a potential rift between the Western Allies and the Soviets. But beneath every rationalization lay the same buried truth. The war was lost. In 1944, that truth became undeniable. On June 6th, Allied armies stormed Normandy's beaches. Within days, it was clear the Western Front couldn't be held indefinitely. German forces were overstretched, fuel-starved, and hampered by Hitler's micromanagement. The generals who had once prided themselves on mobile warfare were now reduced to executing suicidal orders dictated from a map room hundreds of kilometers away. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, saw the situation clearly. Touring the front lines, he confided to his staff that the war was hopeless. "The enemy's material superiority is overwhelming," he said. "Every day we prolong this war is a crime." Rommel quietly urged Hitler to negotiate peace with the Western Allies, but Hitler's response was fury. When the July 20th assassination plot failed, Rommel was implicated. Faced with the choice between trial and death, he chose the latter. Other generals met similar fates. Gunther von Kluge, commanding in the West, also came under suspicion after the failed plot. Summoned to Berlin, he swallowed poison en route. Many others were executed outright. The officer corps was decimated by its own despair. The failure of the July plot had a chilling effect. Whatever illusions of internal reform or military salvation remained were extinguished. The surviving generals understood that the regime would destroy itself, and them with it. Still, they continued to fight, partly from duty, partly from fear. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. The Red Army was advancing through East Prussia and Silesia. The Western Allies were crossing the Rhine. The country lay in ruins. And yet, Hitler continued issuing impossible orders. Cities were to be held to the last man. Armies that no longer existed were ordered to counterattack. Civilians were to be conscripted into a people's militia. Many generals no longer obeyed. They falsified reports, ignored orders, or quietly surrendered their commands. Others clung to the fantasy that the Western Allies might turn against the Soviets and join Germany in a final anti-Bolshevik crusade. But such hopes were delusions born of desperation. In April, as the Soviets closed in on Berlin, the last vestiges of discipline disintegrated. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of betrayal and cowardice. Yet even he could no longer deny what they had known for years. On April 22nd, during a meeting in the Führer bunker, he broke down completely, admitting the war was lost and that suicide was his only escape. For the generals, the moment carried no relief. They had lived through the disintegration of everything they once believed in: honor, discipline, and the myth of German superiority. Some, like General Walter Wenck, tried to rescue civilians fleeing the Soviets. Others simply waited for capture. A few, like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, remained loyal to the end, signing the unconditional surrender that marked the final humiliation of the regime they had served so faithfully. Looking back, one might wonder how men so intelligent, so experienced, could have deluded themselves for so long. The answer lies partly in ideology, partly in pride, and partly in fear. Many of Hitler's generals shared his contempt for democracy and his hatred of communism. They believed that whatever his flaws, Hitler had restored Germany's honor and rebuilt its army. To admit defeat was to admit that everything they had fought for since 1933, and indeed since 1918, had been a lie. Others were trapped by circumstance. The Wehrmacht wasn't a monolith. It was a vast institution bound by loyalty, habit, and hierarchy. To rebel against Hitler was to betray not just a leader, but an entire system of obedience that defined a soldier's identity. When the first hints of defeat appeared, most officers chose denial over defiance. When defeat became certain, they lacked the moral courage to act upon it. Yet there were exceptions, men like Stauffenberg, Beck, and Tresckow, who risked everything to end the madness. Their failure sealed Germany's fate. After July 1944, the war became an exercise in futility, a slow-motion collapse carried forward by inertia and terror. Millions more would die before the inevitable surrender. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the reckoning began. In Allied interrogation rooms and post-war memoirs, the generals spoke freely at last. They blamed Hitler, the SS, the party, anyone but themselves. They claimed they had seen the disaster coming and tried to avert it. Some even portrayed themselves as victims of a mad dictator they couldn't control. There was truth in some of these claims, but also evasion. Many who later insisted they knew it was lost had continued obeying orders that prolonged the slaughter. They had rationalized their complicity as duty. The tragedy of Germany's generals wasn't merely that they recognized defeat too late. It was that even when they did, they lacked the will to stop it. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the rubble of Berlin, the evidence of failure was plain. By 1943, the war was strategically lost. By 1944, militarily hopeless. By 1945, morally bankrupt. But long before the final capitulation, in the quiet moments between battles, many of Hitler's generals had already surrendered in their hearts. They could see what he could not, that Germany's destiny was sealed not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the arrogance of 1941, when they mistook blitzkrieg for omnipotence and mistook conquest for invulnerability. The tragedy of the Wehrmacht was that it kept fighting long after it knew it was beaten. And in doing so, it ensured that defeat would not only destroy Hitler, but the nation he had promised to make eternal. That is how defeat truly unfolded, not in a single climactic moment, but as a creeping awareness that spread through the very men who had once believed they commanded destiny itself. When Hitler's generals realized they had lost, there was no announcement, no proclamation, only silence, disbelief, and the slow, inevitable disintegration of faith. They had gambled everything on victory. When it failed them, there was nothing left to believe.